The National Treasury is facing mounting criticism this week following its draft proposal to introduce a 20% national tax on the gross gambling revenue of all online gambling activities, both licensed and unlicensed. A move that industry players warn could destabilize the legal market and push more South Africans towards illegal operators. The proposal, which Treasury says could raise up to 10 billion rand for the fiscus, comes amid skyrocketing online gambling turnover, a reported 25% gross rise in gross gambling revenue, and growing concerns about harm, addiction, and the massive proliferation of offshore illegal gambling platforms draining billions from the country. Industry leaders argue the tax was drafted without proper consultation, warning that the combined burden of VAT, provincial levies, and a new 20% national tax could make South Africa one of the most heavily taxed gambling markets in the world and may unintentionally strengthen the illegal operators who already dominate more than half the market. For more on this, we speak to Chris Axelson, who is the Deputy Director General for Tax and Financial Sector Policy at the National Treasury. Chris, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Chris, you hear from industries all the time in your line of work that if you increase tax or some form of levy on our operations, that you will inadvertently allow the black market to thrive. Cigarette manufacturers are saying that, the alcohol sector is saying that, and now the gambling sector are making the exact same argument. Is there any logic behind that sentiment?
Thanks, and thanks for having us here. A couple of points there that you've made, like the mounting criticism, the only criticism that comes from the industry, and we need to actually get some inputs from other players in society about this. The other point is, that we haven't consulted them. No, we haven't consulted them because this is the start of the consultation process. So we've put this discussion paper out to say, this is what we are proposing. Now we can consult. Let's have discussions. Let's see what, whether these fears that you are putting forward are real or not. And then we can assess them and provide advice to the minister. And then the minister can potentially make an announcement later. So this is part of the consultation. In terms of your point about, the illegal operators, alcohol, tobacco, and it is true. So the alcohol industry, they've been putting forward that there's a lot more illicit trade. The tobacco industry, there is a lot of illicit trade there. I mean, it's almost more than half of the market. So we need to clamp down on an enforcement perspective for that. Is gambling the same in this respect? There are a couple of reports saying that there's a huge amount of offshore gambling taking place, but a lot of the gambling that we see is advertised, it's in airports, it's sports teams that are local operators, and a lot of people are taking advantage of the local operators to gamble. We have already legislation through the Reserve Bank, through our exchange control system, where the banks aren't allowed to provide payments to foreign operators for gambling. And if those gambling winnings come back, we could actually seize those winnings. So there would be a huge cost to the individual punter if they were then to use these offshore and illegal operators to then lose all their fees and all their winnings. But this is part of the discussion that we need to have. We can try and increase enforcement to reduce that illicit activity. And it's about how successful that enforcement will be. We, for example, really need to focus on tobacco. There's a growing concern about alcohol, which we've noted from industry, and we will see. But I think the society that we need to have for online gambling really needs to be discussed. And, that is the main aim of this proposal. We're worried about it. As you said, we're worried about mental health issues, financial distress issues, social harm. We need to do something about it. And as National Treasury, we're proposing that we put a levy on this industry.
What is the primary objective behind this discussion paper and the proposal, Chris? Is it revenue collection? 10 billion is a lot of money. It could fund half of what is our relief of social distress grant at the moment. Or is it, on the other hand, harm reduction, as you've just described there, social, financial distress, mental health, addiction? What is the primary objective here?
Well, so the way we look at it is we actually look at it in a very similar way to alcohol and tobacco. It's about trying to reduce this activity to reduce harm for society. And, the way we talk about it and economists talk about it is that there are these negative externalities where there are all these other social costs to gambling, but they're not priced in the market. So the way to price it in is to put a levy on it. And then hopefully it's it'll be less attractive to those who want to bet because they know that, well,
Chris, you and
actually,
I
I'm not
both
going to get
know.
as good a return
Yeah.
because the tax is on it. And it'll reduce the potential benefits that the local operators can provide. Like you get a free 100
Can I
rand or
just
free
pause you there,
200
Chris?
rand. That's the
Because
main aim. But we will get revenue, and if we don't reduce the activity, the revenue will come in. But then that revenue can be used for things like education, health, etc., to try and help society.
yeah, so two things very quickly. You and I both know that the data suggests to us that excise is an ineffective instrument to deter the consumption of alcohol or cigarettes or even gambling, that excise oftentimes only ever raises revenue, that somebody who's determined on gambling will continue to do so. Excise goes up at least inflation +1 every single year on average. Yet we don't see the volumes dropping that are being consumed in South Africa, again, proving to be quite inefficient in dissuading people from participating. That's the one. Talk to me about how you imagine that it would work in this instance of gambling. But secondly and importantly, on an excise instrument, is that if the intention is harm reduction, does the discussion paper originate from the Department of Social Development, from the Department of Health, or does it originate from the Chambers of National Treasury, whose concern, by the way, is not around social impact and harm reduction? It's about effectively balancing the books.
No, thanks. So it is just from the National Treasury. So like part of the discussion is a wider government discussion that we have to have. The minister did agree with the Minister of the DTIC to get this out, but we need to get inputs as well from other government departments. But it's about harm reduction, and it's our way of saying that we are worried we need to get this done. So there are a lot of further discussions that we have to have. I think people are jumping the gun. They're thinking that this is already done, but it's not done. You need a minister to announce it. The Treasury can't announce something and will be done. So those are the discussions that we need to have.
Yeah, but let's talk about the efficiency of excise as an instrument in deterrence. The data doesn't seem to support that.
No, well, I think it does. There's a lot of, we did an alcohol discussion paper that we released last year at this time, where there are elasticities. Where you increase the price, people will reduce consumption. The problem is, if it is easy to get an illicit beer or bottle of wine, or it's easy to get illicit tobacco, then it's very quick for them to turn because they are price sensitive. And because they're price sensitive, they'll then turn to this legal market. And that's what we've really got to focus on closing down. This case is slightly different because we're not taxing it on a per bet basis. We're taxing the company itself in terms of its gross gambling revenue. So we're not sure how they are going to pass that on. Maybe they won't pass it on. So maybe it'll keep the same returns for the bets that the consumers can get, and then it won't have a reduction in activity. But then we get a lot of additional revenue. And if we get a lot of additional revenue, then we can potentially look at not increasing personal income taxes or other types of taxes to provide some relief to the economy. That's how we're looking at it. Our main aim is to reduce that activity, but it might not work. But if it doesn't work, then we do get a lot of additional revenue.
Just for clarity, the mechanics is not that the levy will be placed on the consumer. That is to say, if I cash out my gambling winnings that I am due to SARS 20% of whatever my gambling winnings are, it is a levy that's placed on the operator.
Yeah, so we're trying to do it in the same way that the provincial governments do the tax. So the provincial governments already tax between 6 and 9% the gross gambling revenue, which is the amount that they get in wages minus the amount that's actually paid out in winnings. And it's the amount that's sort of kicked by the gambling operator. So we're proposing a 20% levy on that amount, which is the same. So it's not on a per wager basis. The individual won't have to worry about it, but the operator will have to decide how they actually pass that on or if they pass that on to the consumer.
So how do you rationalize this as a harm reduction instrument if it doesn't hurt the pocket or doesn't inconvenience the consumer in this instance? Because ultimately the consumer that has to make the decision, is this worth it or not? Similarly in alcohol and cigarettes and tobacco, the levy is passed on to the consumer primarily, and down the line the operator, manufacturer and producer feels the pressure of reduced demand. In this instance, you're not targeting the consumer at all. How does this then rationalize as a harm reduction instrument?
Well, actually, so on alcohol and tobacco, sometimes it's not passed on to the consumer either. So, even on alcohol, we charge it at the manufacturing gate as the beer leaves the manufacturer, and they might not pass it on. And in some years, they haven't, which meant that the tax rate as a proportion of the price just kept going up because they weren't passing it on. So in those instances, it also might not. In this case, it's up to them. So it might pass on. They might have less money for advertising, which would also be a good thing because you're not pushing this onto society as hard as you were before. Or they would then actually change the amount that they pay out to keep their profitability at that level. So we're not sure because we're not going to force a company to act in a particular way. We just apply a levy, and then they must make the decisions themselves. But we do hope this levy will have one of those impacts to try and reduce the harm. The other point is just the signal it's providing from government to say, look, this is a very worrisome trend that we are seeing, and there are some serious social harms that are here. And we need to act, and government does need to act. And we'll be very interested to hear comments from other people in society,
Yeah.
from NGOs, and not just the industry when we actually finish this consultation process.
So let me just reframe that question, because I still want to understand how this is rationalized as a harm reduction instrument if it potentially could never inconvenience the consumer, because the operator might just decide, we'll just go with reduced margins, we'll continue to advertise at the same aggression, and we will stomach some losses if necessary on the short term so that we can have the long-term gain, not inconveniencing the consumer at all. In that instance, I don't see how it could be a harm reduction instrument if the concern, as you described it there, is around mental health, financial distress, and of course, mitigating addiction.
No, so in that case, it might not. And, I completely agree with you. It might not change behavior. But then these local operators won't have as much revenue, but then the government will have revenue. And then the government can potentially look at to say, well, what will this money go towards? At the moment, we haven't proposed any particular ring fencing for this expenditure, but that's something that we can consider.
Right.
Should we say, well, should we give more for, responsible gambling programs or other types of helplines? Or, what can we do? What can we use this revenue for? So that can be part of this discussion that we have. So I completely agree with you. It might not. Tax is a blunt instrument, and we know it's a blunt instrument. It's a blunt instrument in other areas as well. We hope it will reduce harm. If it doesn't, we will get the revenue, and then hopefully we can reduce harm through that. And those are the discussions that we need to have.
Yeah. Chris, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Chris Axelson is the Deputy Director General for Tax in the National Treasury.